Have you ever wondered why someone who acts like they don't care still somehow feels impossible to forget and even harder to escape from in your own mind? Stay with this until the end, because what you are about to understand will change the way you see silence, distance, and emotional withdrawal forever. You will stop chasing answers and start seeing the truth behind what really happens inside an avoidant mind. At first, it looks simple. They pull away, they become quiet, they stop responding the way they used to, and your mind tells you a painful story that they have moved on, that they don't feel the same, that you were easy to leave behind. But here is the part most people never see. Silence is not always emptiness. Distance is not always detachment, and walking away is not always freedom. Sometimes silence is where the noise becomes unbearable. An avoidant does not run because nothing is there. They run because something is there that they cannot control. Something unfamiliar. Something deep. Something that breaks the system they have relied on for so long. They are used to managing emotions by keeping them at a safe distance. They survive by staying in control. They feel secure when nothing touches them too deeply. But when someone enters their life and reaches that hidden space, everything changes. Now their mind is no longer quiet. Now your words replay at unexpected moments. Your energy lingers in places they thought were empty. Your presence does not leave when you leave, and this is where confusion begins. Not for you, but for them. Because they don't understand why they can't just switch it off. You see, most people think emotions fade with distance, but for an avoidant, distance often amplifies what they are trying to suppress. The more they step away, the more their mind tries to process what they are avoiding. It is like trying not to think about something, and suddenly it becomes the only thing you can think about. They try to distract themselves. They fill their time. They keep moving. They act normal on the outside. But internally, something keeps pulling them back, not physically, mentally, quietly, repeatedly. And that is the part they never show, because showing it would mean admitting something they are not ready to face. An avoidant fears emotional exposure more than emotional loss. Losing someone hurts, yes, but losing control of themselves, that feels even more dangerous. So when feelings grow stronger than what they can manage, their instinct is not to lean in. Their instinct is to escape. But here is the truth that changes everything. You cannot escape something that has already entered your mind. And once you reach that depth inside someone, your absence does not erase you. It transforms you into a thought that keeps returning, a memory that does not sit still, a feeling that shows up when they least expect it. This is why their silence can feel so confusing, because while you are questioning if they care, they are questioning why they cannot stop thinking. They may never say it out loud, they may never admit it directly, but the human mind does not lie to itself forever. When something is real, it leaves a mark, and that mark does not disappear just because someone chooses distance. In fact, sometimes distance is where the impact becomes undeniable, because when you are no longer there to fill the space starts to speak. It reminds them of what felt different, what felt real, what felt unfamiliar in a way they could not control. And that is where the internal conflict begins to grow. Part of them wants to ignore it, to move on, to stay in the comfort of emotional distance. But another part, the part they try to silence, keeps bringing you back into their thoughts. Not because they want to feel it, but because they cannot avoid it anymore. And this is where most people misunderstand the situation. They think if they cared, they would come back. But avoidants do not operate on simple emotional logic. Caring does not always lead to action. Sometimes caring leads to fear. Sometimes caring leads to withdrawal. Sometimes the deeper the feeling, the stronger the need to run. Because what they feel does not feel safe. It feels overwhelming. It feels like losing control. It feels like something they cannot predict. And the human mind will always try to escape what it cannot control. But escaping does not mean escaping mentally. That is why even in their distance, even in their silence, even in their absence, the thought of you remains. Not constantly, not loudly, but persistently. It comes and goes. It appears in quiet moments. It returns when distractions fade. It lingers when they least expect it. And slowly, without them realizing it at first, that silence they created becomes filled with something they cannot shut down. You. Not your presence, but your impact. Not your voice, but your echo. And that is where the real story begins. What makes one person stay in someone's mind while everyone else slowly fades into the background? That is the question most people never stop to ask. And the answer is deeper than attraction, deeper than chemistry, deeper than timing. Because when someone becomes unforgettable to an avoidant, it usually has nothing to do with surface level charm. It has everything to do with emotional disruption. Some people are easy to leave because they never touched anything real. They were pleasant, temporary, replaceable. But every now and then, someone arrives who does not just enter a person's life. They enter the part of them that has been hidden for years. And that is where things begin to shift. Avoidants are not strangers to connection. They can talk, they can laugh, they can share time, they can even create closeness for a while. But what they are not used to is being deeply affected. They are not used to meeting someone who stirs what they have spent years trying to keep buried. That is what makes the difference. Not intensity on the outside, not drama, not pressure, but the quiet shock of being emotionally seen. And that kind of experience is hard to erase. Human psychology works in a very simple but powerful way. The mind remembers what feels unfinished. It remembers what challenged its emotional patterns. It remembers what made it feel something unusual. This is why avoidants often cannot forget the person who made them feel safe and exposed at the same time. That combination creates tension inside them, and tension is not easy to ignore. They may have met many people before you. Maybe they felt attraction, maybe they enjoyed attention, maybe they had options. But none of that matters when someone reaches the nervous system in a way they were not prepared for. Because once a person becomes emotionally significant, they stop being just a memory. They become a psychological imprint. That imprint follows them. It follows them because you represented something dangerous to their old identity. You represented closeness without control, care without performance, depth without games. And for someone who has built their life around emotional distance, that kind of connection does not feel simple. It feels like a threat to the structure they depend on. This is why they can walk away and still carry you with them, not because they are weak, not because they are pretending, but because the human mind cannot instantly delete what exposed a deeper truth. When someone makes you feel more than you are used to feeling, your inner world does not return to normal overnight. Something changes, even if you try to deny it, and that is exactly what many avoidants do. They deny it to themselves first. They tell themselves it was not that serious. They minimize the bond. They act as if it was just another passing chapter. But the body often tells a different story. The mind often tells a different story. Because while they are trying to stay detached, their inner world keeps revisiting what happened. Why? Because what is pushed down does not, it waits. It waits in the background until a quiet moment arrives, until loneliness gets louder, until distraction stops working, until something reminds them of the one person who made them feel more than they wanted to feel. And then the memory returns. Not always in a dramatic way. Sometimes it is subtle, a sentence, a feeling, a moment that appears without warning. But that is how emotional residue works. It stays in pieces, it stays in fragments. And over time, those fragments become harder to ignore. This is why trying to force yourself into an avoidance mind rarely works. But being deeply genuine often does. Because real emotional impact cannot be manufactured. It happens when someone feels something beyond logic, something beyond strategy, something beyond what they can explain. That is what unsettles them. You were not just another person asking for love. You became a mirror. And mirrors are hard to forget. A mirror shows someone what is there even when they are not ready to look. It reveals the hunger beneath the detachment, the fear beneath the coolness, the longing beneath the self-protection. And once someone has been seen at that level, it becomes difficult for them to go back to emotional numbness without feeling the difference. That is why they think of you, not always because they want to reconnect, sometimes because they cannot understand why your absence still has weight, why your energy still lingers, why your name still carries emotion, why their mind keeps returning to something they tried so hard to leave behind. And the deeper reason is this: you disrupted their emotional blueprint. People become memorable when they challenge the pattern a person lives inside. If an avoidant is used to shallow contact, then sincerity feels powerful. If they are used to emotional escape, then steady presence feels disarming. If they are used to hiding, then being understood feels almost unbearable. That is why certain people stay in the mind longer than expected. They represent a version of connection that cannot be easily categorized or dismissed. And once that happens, the old coping methods begin to fail. Distance no longer feels clean. Avoidance no longer feels peaceful. Indifference no longer feels convincing because something inside them knows that what they felt was not ordinary. That is what makes the thought of you so persistent. Not fantasy, not obsession for no reason, but the mind trying to make sense of an emotional experience that does not fit the old survival pattern. And when the mind cannot explain something easily, it keeps returning to it again and again until one day they are forced to admit that you were not easy to forget because you were never just another experience. You became the feeling they could not organize, the truth they could not silence, the connection they could not fully name. And that is why even after distance, even after withdrawal, even after all the effort to shut it down, you still remain where it matters most. Inside the place they thought no one could reach. And that is when the hardest part begins. Not when they leave, but when they finally discover that nothing after you feels the same. At first, they truly believe separation will solve everything. They convince themselves that space will bring relief. They tell themselves that if they stay busy enough, meet enough people, or keep life moving fast enough, whatever they felt will eventually disappear. This is the lie many emotionally guarded people depend on. They trust time only when time is filled with distraction. They trust movement because stillness asks too many dangerous questions. So, they keep going. They return to routines. They throw themselves into work. They scroll, talk, laugh, and continue living on the surface. From the outside, it may even look like they are doing just fine, but deep inside, something strange begins to happen. The world keeps moving, yet a certain emptiness does not move with it. It stays quietly, patiently, like a missing piece they do not want to name. That is the moment reality starts pressing against denial because there is a huge difference between meeting people and feeling moved by someone. There is a huge difference between attention and resonance. There is a huge difference between temporary comfort and a connection that reached beneath the mask. And eventually, even the most emotionally defended person begins to notice that difference. They start comparing without meaning to. Not always consciously. Sometimes it happens in small ways. A conversation feels flat. A laugh feels forced. A new connection feels easy but empty. They may keep trying to convince themselves that this is enough, that this is safer, that this is what they wanted all along. But the heart has a strange way of exposing what the mind tries to edit, because once you have felt something rare, ordinary starts to feel louder in its absence. This is where regret often begins its slow and painful work. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind people confess immediately, but the silent kind, the kind that grows in private, the kind that visits at night, the kind that shows up when life gets quiet and there is no one left to impress. That is when they start realizing that what they walked away from was not just a person, it was a feeling they cannot recreate on command, and that truth hits harder than they expected. Human psychology is powerful here. The brain often takes for granted what feels available. It assumes there will always be another chance, another person, another emotional spark somewhere ahead. But when enough time passes and nothing truly replaces what was lost, the nervous system begins to recognize value too late. That is when absence becomes education. That is when loss becomes clarity. Suddenly, what they once tried to escape begins to look different. Your presence no longer feels overwhelming in memory. It starts to feel meaningful. Your consistency no longer feels threatening in reflection. It starts to feel rare. Your depth no longer feels like pressure in hindsight. It starts to feel like truth. And this is where their inner conflict becomes impossible to ignore, because now they are not only carrying thoughts of you, they are carrying evidence. Evidence that what they had with you touched a level that cannot be copied through convenience, attraction, or familiarity. Evidence that some bonds do not disappear simply because someone lacked the courage to hold them properly. That realization is heavy. It forces them to face something most avoidants spend years avoiding: emotional accountability. Not blame, not shame, but truth. The truth that distance did not protect them. The truth that shutting down did not heal them. The truth that running only delayed what they would one day have to feel anyway. And once that understanding enters, the walls that once felt powerful begin to feel exhausting. This is one of the most overlooked emotional shifts in an avoidance journey. At first, walls feel like safety. They feel intelligent. They feel necessary. But over time, when those same walls block the very thing the soul needed, they stop feeling protective. They start feeling like confinement. That is when their own defenses begin to trap them. Now imagine what that does to the mind. To know that the thing you pushed away was not a threat, but something meaningful. To know that the peace you thought you were choosing has turned into emotional emptiness. To know that all the control in the world cannot manufacture the one thing you lost through fear. That is not easy to sit with. And this is why certain memories become stronger with time instead of weaker. Not because the past becomes more beautiful than it was, but because distance removes the noise and leaves only what was real. It strips away the ego, the confusion, the avoidance, the temporary stories they told themselves, and what remains is essence. What remains is emotional truth. What remains is the recognition that not every person was just passing through. Some people leave fingerprints on the soul. Some people awaken hunger where numbness used to live. Some people become the standard by accident simply because they brought something honest into a space built on defense. That is why replacement becomes difficult. Not impossible in appearance, but impossible in depth, because they are not really searching for another face. They are unconsciously searching for the same feeling, the same emotional safety, the same quiet intensity, the same unspoken understanding. And the painful part is this: they may look everywhere for it while knowing deep down that what they are searching for already had a name: yours. This is where many people misunderstand what it means to matter. They think being unforgettable means being dramatic, loud, addictive, impossible to ignore in obvious ways. But that is not true. The deepest impact is often quiet. It is not chaos that stays with people. It is authenticity. It is how safe they felt around you, how alive they felt without pretending, how deeply they were affected by something they could not explain. That is what returns to them, not just your image, but the emotional atmosphere of being with you. And once that starts haunting the spaces where distraction used to work, they are left with one unavoidable truth. Some losses do not hurt because they were intense. They hurt because they were real. That is when the illusion finally breaks. That is when they stop believing every connection is replaceable. That is when they begin to understand that what touched them through you was not ordinary, not casual, not easily found again. And whether they admit it or not, that realization changes, because now they know what they cannot unknow. Now they have felt what they cannot unfelt. Now they carry the weight of something they once tried to outrun, only to discover it had already become part of them. And once that truth settles in, something powerful begins to happen. The focus is no longer on why they ran. The focus becomes who you became through the pain. Because this is the part many people miss. When someone withdraws, the natural reaction is to question your worth. You replay everything. You wonder what you lacked. You wonder what you should have done differently. You start measuring your value through someone else's inability to hold closeness. And without realizing it, you hand your power to the very wound that broke your peace. But the real turning point begins the moment you stop asking, why couldn't they stay? And start asking, what did this experience reveal inside me? That is where healing becomes strength. That is where pain stops being a prison and starts becoming a mirror. Because the deepest lesson was never about proving yourself to the person who shut down. It was about recognizing that your presence carried weight even if they were too emotionally unprepared to handle it. You did not fail because someone retreated from what was genuine. In many cases, your impact was the exact reason they could not remain steady. And that changes everything. It means your value was not hidden in how hard you chased. It was not buried inside how much you explained, waited, tolerated, or sacrificed. It was always in what your energy awakened without force, in the way your sincerity reached places that had been locked for years, in the way your truth made avoidance harder to maintain. That is not weakness, that is power, and not the loud kind, not the desperate kind, not the kind that begs to be chosen, the rare kind, the kind that leaves an imprint without trying to control the outcome, the kind that does not need to scream to be remembered, the kind that remains long after the moment has passed. This is where human psychology reveals something important. People are not always transformed by what they can easily understand. They are transformed by what makes them feel deeply enough to confront themselves. That is why certain connections continue to live in the mind, not because they were perfect, but because they exposed truth. And truth is difficult to erase. You became significant because something about you disrupted emotional autopilot. You made them feel beyond habit, beyond routine, beyond the numb safety they had built their identity around. And whether they embraced it or resisted it, the result was the same. Something inside them shifted. Now, listen carefully, because this may be the part you need most. You do not need to chase what has already been touched by your truth. You do not need to convince what has already been affected. You do not need to reduce yourself to be understood by someone who is still learning how to face themselves. That is where many people lose their center. They believe that if they just love harder, explain better, stay longer, or prove more, they will finally be seen. But real worth does not beg for recognition. Real worth stands. It grows. It continues becoming even when someone else lacks the maturity to meet it. That is the mindset that changes your life. Because once you understand your power correctly, you stop collapsing every time someone pulls away. You stop taking every withdrawal as a reflection of your insufficiency. You begin to see emotional unavailability for what it is. Not your failure, but their unfinished inner work. And that awareness brings freedom. Freedom from overthinking every silence. Freedom from chasing closure that may never come in words. Freedom from shrinking your light just to make someone feel less exposed around it. That is where your energy becomes magnetic in a different way. Not because you are trying to be unforgettable, but because you are no longer abandoning yourself in the hope of being chosen. That kind of self-respect changes your presence. It changes your posture. It changes your decisions. It changes the way you carry your pain. Instead of using heartbreak as proof that you were not enough, you begin to use it as evidence that you are capable of creating something emotionally real. And that matters, because many people spend their whole lives surrounded by attention, yet never truly move anyone at a soul level. You did, and whether they return or remain distant, that truth does not disappear. This is why the strongest position is never obsession. It is alignment. It is knowing who you are without needing constant confirmation. It is understanding that your role was not to force someone into readiness. It was to remain true to the depth you carry. Some people will recognize it and stay. Others will feel it, fear it, and run. But none of that changes what you brought into the connection. That is why your next step is not to wait in emotional suspension. It is to rise, to rebuild your focus, to protect your peace, to stop making your future dependent on someone else's emotional timing. Because the moment you stop chasing what ran, you begin reclaiming what was always yours: your clarity, your dignity, your inner authority. And here is the deepest truth of all. The people who leave while carrying your imprint are often forced to face your value in your absence, but you do not need to sit in pain just to witness that realization. Your job is not to stand still and hope one day they understand. Your job is to keep becoming the version of yourself that no longer confuses rejection with truth. because your truth is not found in who stayed or left. Your truth is found in what remained alive inside you despite disappointment. Your truth is found in your ability to love without becoming small. Your truth is found in your ability to lose something and still not lose yourself. That is the real victory. Not getting them back, not hearing the perfect apology, not watching them finally admit what you meant. The real victory is becoming so rooted in your own worth that whether they remember you or not no longer defines your peace. And ironically, that is often when your presence becomes the most unforgettable. Because there is nothing more powerful than someone who has been hurt but did not let the hurt make them chase what was not ready. Nothing more powerful than someone who turned confusion into wisdom. Nothing more powerful than someone who stopped asking for permission to know their value. So if they cannot escape the thought of you, let that be their lesson. But your lesson is greater. Your lesson is to become so whole, so grounded, so deeply aligned with your own worth that no one's fear can ever make you forget who you are again.